Go ahead and get started. This elective is titled Hegemony and the Critique, or Hegemony and the K, and it will describe the strategic benefits and pitfalls of reading large impacts against the K on both sides, with a particular focus on hegemony and other impacts in the international relations, or IR, area. This lecture will not focus on answering these strategies because there's not time and that's not really the goal, but there will be insights on the weaknesses of various hard right, so they're called strategies, that you will be able to glean from this lecture if answering them is more your goal. I will kind of try to do spots for answering questions as they come up. I encourage you all to put questions in the chat if you have them, and then when I go through, I can go and answer them as we have time. So first things first, in order to read a hegemony-ish strategy against the K, you need to know what you're talking about. This is incredibly important and will be the majority of this lecture. If you have a weak grasp of the theoretical defense and assumptions behind your argument, you'll quickly get burned by a competent K-team. And alternatively, knowing why your authors think your argument is true will not only make you a more competent advocate of that position, but it would also reveal framework answers, as you'll be able to coherently articulate defenses of your epistemology. Like, imagine that, actually being able to say that your epistemology is true against the K. In order for us to get there, in order for you to know what you are talking about in a debate like this, you'll need to become what I like to call a temporary academic. Things like the foreign affairs and foreign policy magazines will be your best friend as you execute strategies like this. And the reason is that you want to learn the language of the discipline. And I'm going to briefly, or hopefully briefly, introduce the various theories of international relations that will help kind of understand ultimately the interaction between hegemony and other international relations impacts and critique arguments. Okay, so international relations theory begins in a sense with classical realism, which is originated by Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes in various ways. And this theory believes that the behavior of states in kind of the international arena is reflective of human nature, of which these scholars take a very cynical view. Humans, to classical realists, are self-interested, antagonistic, and ruthless. However, despite this basic condition of primal antagonism, humans approach this condition differently, such that the various attitudes, egos, and personalities of different national leaders has a direct effect on their strategy. This led to the creation of various archetypes of national leaders and profiles of how they behaved, and has historically led to the valorization of strength in leaders. So classical realists traditionally believed that because humans are fundamentally bad, antagonistic, and competitive, that the only way for a nation or a national leader to succeed on the international stage is through strength. And that strength is not only reflected in the military or economic power of a various nation that they may lead, but also in their personality. The way that they approach problems should be from strength. This basic debate occurred in the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, where there was a debate internally within the US between JFK's advisors over which personality or tone or posture he should adopt when dealing with the Soviet Union trying to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. And some of his advisors advised absolute strength and the willingness to launch preemptively against the Soviet Union should they aggress, and others advised more restraint. This debate has played out through decades, if not centuries, in American foreign policy and in other places, and is kind of the hallmark output of classical realism. This is typically because of Hobbes's idea of international anarchy, Hobbes originally wrote, in a philosophical sense, in advocacy of a sovereign world government, or something to coordinate the affairs and behaviors of various states. And he did that because he believed that humans, like I kind of explained, are antagonistic and competitive. And he believed that the only way to fix or stop those competitive antagonistic behaviors from spiraling into unending conflict is by coordinating them through sovereign world government. Because, though, he recognized we don't live in a world with a sovereign world government that coordinates the behavior and affairs of various countries, we exist in a state of international anarchy. International anarchy being that there's no coordinating authority that governs what states can or cannot do. Everyone is ultimately allowed to do whatever they want on the international stage. There's no, penalty for acting any which way automatically. Instead, we just exist in this anarchic state. There's a kind of a famous international relations quote that describes the state of anarchy as international leaders meeting under an empty sky from which the gods have departed. So there's no longer a coordinating power to determine what actions are right or which actions are wrong. You may be thinking that there are such bodies, the international institutions, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and things like that, and we'll get to those. But classical realism does not recognize those institutions as having any true coordinating power. That really, international institutions are a ruse that cover up the intrinsic self-motivated behavior of states under an anarchic international system. After classical realism arose neorealism, or structural realism, which was advanced by Waltz and Mearsheimer. Neorealism shares the same Hobbesian description of an anarchic international world as classical realism does, but argues that instead states are discrete but functionally identical entities, as opposed to those controlled by the various individual traits of human nature that use military power to enforce and defend their will on the international stage, which is still characterized by a fundamental antagonism or anarchic relationship between them, which is due to limited resources and territory, and a fundamental condition of insecurity. Neorealism's response to classical realism is in its name, that there is a structural explanation for how states behave that is different than classical realism. Because while classical realism asserts that states are governed primarily by the individual personalities and interpretations of human nature of their leaders, structural realism argues that states basically behave the same, and regardless of human nature, that states behave as any logical entity within a game with a set of rules would predict they do. And so out of neorealism, we also get the outgrowth of game theory, which is the attempt to predict the behavior and conditions of states by describing all of the logical preconditions for the international sphere. It's the fact that there's no coordinating world government, the relative power and strength and weaknesses and insecurity of various countries, and then predicting what will happen based on what kind of formulas and algorithms spit out about what states would logically do in various circumstances. According to this system, the anarchy creates a self-help system where states are reliant on their own means for their survival and prosperity. In a self-help system, if someone else has something, for example, a resource or territory that you need, the only means to obtain it are to strike a deal that is more beneficial to you than it costs. More on that later, but it's basically why states don't fight all the time, according to realists, or to take it by force, primarily military force. This theory also presumes that states are rational actors, and this is different than classical realism's take, that states are rational actors that will always make decisions according to their self-interest. However, they're not perfect in that states don't have all of the information they may need in order to make a decision that is best for their self-interest, and therefore insecurity and miscalculation, according to neorealists, arise out of incomplete information. Neorealism as a theory is actually further subdivided into offensive and defensive neorealism. In your course of debate, you may have heard things like offensive and defensive realists, that states can be an offensive realist or a defensive realist, and they behave according to those principles. That is actually a slight misinterpretation of neorealism's original premise, or the division in these theories between offensive and defensive neorealism. Defensive neorealists, which is how Waltz is now categorized, Waltz being the first kind of structural realist, say that the primary motivation of states is the maintenance of their own security, so sovereignty and territory, against the invasion or degradation by another state. Whereas offensive realists like Mearsheimer, who's kind of in the second wave of neorealism, believe that states' primary motivation is expansion. Both of these motivations are actually potential explanations for conflict. It's not that like defensive neorealism creates less conflict because states are less aggressive. Under defensive neorealism, conflict arises out of insecurity, and it's termed the security dilemma, which I'll explain in a little bit. Whereas under offensive neorealism, conflict arises out of an imbalance of strength that leads to aggression. So the security dilemma, which is the condition or explanation for conflict in defensive neorealism, says that when states take behaviors or take actions that are designed to improve their own security, such as increasing militarization of their border, increasing technological or investment in defense technology, etc., doing a draft of their civilian population so that they have a standing army, that these can be primarily defensive or even exclusively defensive actions, but they can be interpreted by other states as offensive. And thus, a security dilemma arises when states take defensive actions that appear offensive to other states. When this happens, the states that see perceive those defensive actions as offensive, then themselves take defensive actions, which then can subsequently be perceived as offensive by the original state. This can create a spiraling security dilemma where two states that are actually only trying to preserve their own defensive security will actually take increasingly escalatory and eventually offensive actions because they perceive the other as doing the same. This is how arms races happen, or one explanation for how arms races occur, although there is actually more that can happen in a security dilemma than merely an arms race. But in a nuclear arms race, for example, if two states begin developing nuclear programs, both because they want to defend or establish nuclear deterrence with another state, that could be perceived as them trying to develop a nuclear first strike capability by another state, and hence they'll spiral. So security dilemmas are a principal example of how defensive neorealism can still predict conflict, and actually predict a lot of conflict, like the Cold War, nuclear arms race, etc. The very tense geopolitical interactions between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel are also can be described by a security dilemma, where all three countries predict first strikes by the other countries, etc. So that creates spiraling insecurity where none of the countries may even be actually offensive. Under offensive realism, conflict arises out of, like I said, an imbalance of strength. So where one country perceives another country's weakness, it will opportunistically take that chance to seize whatever territory or resource is available to them. This is actually by itself not a complete explanation of conflict, because in true strength imbalance situations, usually there's actually not a large conflict. Usually one state can kind of just demand what it wants or take it by quick force, and you don't have spiraling escalatory conflict like you see in a security dilemma. Instead, under offensive realism, large escalatory conflicts do not occur merely out of an imbalance of strength, but out of a perception of imbalance of strength. And that's because if one leader perceives that they have more strength relative to another state than they actually do, they may be more willing to initiate escalatory aggressive actions against that state. However, if that state that they're initiating aggression against was actually a lot stronger than the original leader suspected, then it can create an escalatory dynamic whereby there's not a quick resolution to conflict, or the secondary state will not agree to a demand, and therefore escalation can occur that way. So in both cases, in both defensive and offensive neorealists' account of how conflict occurs, there's an element of miscalculation. Miscalculation is another important concept I want to cover because it is, again, often misunderstood a little bit by debate and is an important explanation for how war and how conflict happens, that'll ultimately, in kind of some weird backwards ways, help you against the critique. So there's two types of miscalculation. The first type is the type that you've probably already been experiencing in debate, or you're probably already familiar with, which is someone makes just a stupid error. So the sun glints off a nuclear detection satellite and everyone wants to launch a nuclear war. Two submarines bump into each other. One troop accidentally crosses a territorial line, etc. These are the kind of accidental or irrational miscalculations that cannot be explained by a rational actor making a decision. So they're instead irrational because they're based on faulty information, someone making an error, etc. The other type of, and it should be obvious why that can cause war. So, someone looks like you're attacking you and they don't, or someone looks like they're attacking you and they're not. You can't tell. Someone looks like they're attacking you, but it's really someone else, things like that. Or, it's pretty easy to understand how those can cause conflict. The trickier case, though, and the type of miscalculation that I've kind of been alluding to in this elective is miscalculation that arises out of incomplete information. And so that means that a leader has roughly an inaccurate assessment of either their own strength or the strength of an opponent. And both of those are sufficient to cause conflict according to offensive or defensive neorealism, such that if you perceive that you're a lot stronger than you are, you may be more encouraged to take aggressive actions against another country that is perceived as weak. Or if you perceive an enemy is a lot weaker than they are, again, under offensive neorealism, it could encourage a leader to take aggressive action. Similarly, if one country perceives themselves as weaker than they are, they may be more willing to increase defensive or offensive buildup that looks a lot scarier to a rival and thus trigger a security dilemma under defensive neorealism. Or they may perceive an enemy as a lot stronger. And that's kind of the case of the security dilemma that I introduced to you first, like the arms race example, that enemies will perceive one another as a lot stronger than they are and thus necessitate increases in investment in defense technology, arms, nuclear weapons, what have you. I don't want to spoil too much, but neorealism is kind of the heart and soul of the hegemony or primacy debating that you'll be doing against the critique. And one of the reasons why it's so good for that is that it's a really well-defended discipline, that it has a really good combination of structural factors and a lot of statistical testing that has strengthened those structural factors and its assumptions that it makes based on them, while also kind of avoiding the problematic history of classical realism's emphasis on human nature, which at its origin perceived, oftentimes people that weren't white European males as less capable international leaders due to human nature. So neorealism is a departure of that problematic era of classical realism in a way that makes it a little bit more apt to defend against critique arguments while still being very epistemologically sound. As opposed to neorealism is liberalism, which was actually originally developed by Kant and later Keohane, who developed neoliberalism, which is an idea I believe that you all have been familiar with as camp has gone on. Liberalism, in an international sense, is also a structural theory of international relations, but argues that there is not a zero-sum condition between states, but instead that long-lasting, mutually beneficial outcomes are possible through the creation of institutions that foster the sharing of resources like money or norms like democracy. This theory argues that the relations between states don't have to be permanently antagonistic, and we don't have to exist in a permanent state of anarchy, because it is possible to create coordinating institutions that overcome that. There are two examples that you're probably already very familiar with in debate of classical liberalism. The first being interdependence theory, or the trade impact, that countries that trade together don't fight together, or when goods cross borders, armies don't, or when goods don't cross borders, armies do. This is all liberal theory of international relations that says that the shared kind of mutually beneficial interactions between states can modify or decrease their incentives for conflict. The economic recession or interdependence impacts that economic decline causes war is also born out of the liberalism theory. That economic decline or the rapid shattering of some of these international exchanges of goods through institutions can reset states to their primarily antagonistic relationships and thus cause conflict. There's another example of liberal international theory that you also may be accustomed to, which is democratic peace theory, or DPT, which is that democracy also fosters democracy also modulates or decreases the chances for states to go to war. And there's a couple explanations for that. First is that democracy is spread through shared global institutions, which give every country or leader or player a stake in the status quo or of the international system. That every state, because they get to participate democratically in international institutions, are thus invested in the current system of international relations or the current status between states to stay the same. Conversely, autocratic peace theory argues that there's peace through autocratic regimes and that they're more stable, that they're less susceptible to domestic protest, they're less susceptible to changes in who's leading the country, and thus the spread of autocracy is ultimately more stabilizing and creates less conflict. Both of these are actually liberal theories of international relations, even though they're opposites, because they just take a different approach on which kinds of institutions, both domestically and internationally, are the ones that are the most suited to solve conflict. Through this, the structure of anarchy that is described by realists and neo-realists is not fixed, but can be kind of, like I said, modified through the creation of institutions such as the United Nations, which has at least some constraining influence on the self-help behavior of otherwise antagonistic states. This leads me to a discussion of another international relations concept called the status quo, which, very similar to what the idea is in debates you've already had, describes roughly the current order of relative power and the distribution of power between countries. So according to maybe a lot of Western theorists or political scientists, the status quo, or as it should be understood in the current international scene, is one of absolute US military primacy. We spend more on our military than the next 9 countries combined. We have military installations across the world, a large operable nuclear arsenal, and a very entrenched system of alliances, unlike any other country on the planet, including NATO, our alliances with Japan, the Philippines, Korea, and several Latin American countries, as well as some in Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, that are not a part of NATO. This status quo description means that countries, according to Western or American political scientists that are attempting to maintain that situation, are status quo powers, that they are interested or invested in that system, or that they've attached their own security or their own well-being or self-help to that system. The alternative to being a status quo power is being a revisionist power. And as I'm sure you've heard, revisionist powers are those that are attempting to revise or change the status quo in some fundamental way. The mistake that a lot of debate people make is that revisionist powers are ones that must go to war. That is not the case. Revisionism does not imply that a country will have to fight, but instead just says that it's attempting to revise the current geopolitical order. This also, kind of like the description of defensive neorealism that I gave earlier, is subject to perception. That one country's perception of the status quo may be different than another, and therefore 2 countries might think each other are revisionist. This description can be characterized as applying between the United States and Russia, or formerly the Soviet Union, where both countries have a different opinion or perception about what the status quo should be. Where many in Russia believe that the status quo is prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union, where Russia had control over many of the satellite states in Eastern Europe, such as Ukraine and Georgia, that they've now subsequently invaded. Whereas the United States believes that the status quo should be defined as like the 1992 era of Russia / the Soviet Union, where it had already broken up and Russia became the much smaller territorial region that it is now. This description of what the status quo is has immense implications on the likelihood of conflict between the United States and Russia, where if Russia believes that the status quo is is the world where they have control over many countries that are surrounding their borders, it would not be revisionist or even very aggressive for them to invade Ukraine or Georgia or the Baltics, because they believe that they have natural status quo sovereignty over those areas. Whereas to the United States, if it believes that that is not the condition of the status quo, an invasion of Georgia or Ukraine would seem incredibly aggressive, because it looks like it would be like the United States invading Mexico, because there's no interpretation of the status quo, at least to us, that has us including that territory. This is important in your descriptions of other adversaries against the critique, because winning that those countries are fundamentally aggressive against the United States is usually important for describing how conflict will occur. But it actually doesn't require you winning that those countries want to fight a war with the United States, just that there's an irresolvable perception gap over something like, say, the status quo or relative military power, that without an increase in United States primacy would make conflict inevitable. Because while if Russia has a different opinion about the status quo, say that they think that they deserve or to have true sovereignty over various areas around their region, the decision to act on that and the decision to attempt to seize territory is still ultimately modified by the perceived gains from altering the status quo. And the perceived gains from altering the status quo are attached to how strong your adversary is. So if, for example, we put a bunch of military installations and bases and nuclear weapons in all of those satellite states that Russia had sovereignty over, they would have to think a lot harder about invading them, because while that still would not be the status quo to them, it would make us look incredibly revisionist. They would have to accept a very large cost in order to seize those territories back. In case you're wondering, what I just described is NATO, where the United States and a series of European countries put a large set of military installations in various European countries, and also has a defense pact called Article 5, which obligates any member of NATO to defend all the other members of NATO in the instance of an attack. And this was primarily to guard against Russia trying to seize territory in one of its former Soviet states. And thus, this is the United States' way of enforcing its view of the status quo, and is conversely one of the reasons why there's a deep insecurity between Russia and the United States, especially regarding NATO expansion. Because the more countries we add to NATO, the more territory we are kind of claiming is not part of Russia, and thus making the status quo less and less desirable to them. And so a condition of insecurity and of hostility exists between the United States and Russia out of partially an interpretation of what the status quo means. Beyond liberalism is constructivism, which is the answer to neorealism and the answer to neoliberalism and liberalism. And this was invented or kind of forwarded by Onuf and Wendt. Constructivism argues that states are neither functionally identical entities that can be, discretely described as objects such as billiard balls, like neorealism may describe them, that just bump into each other and interact predictably according to the laws of nature. Nor are they discrete or separate, but products of an ongoing construction of society where individuals with various needs and desires create norms, institutions, and societies over time. This historical process has produced, in its current form, a system of roughly different states who do use military power to enforce territorial divisions, but this structure is not determinate or inevitable, which is the primary output of constructivism, insofar as its take on the current international system. Give me one sec. Okay. In contrast to neorealism structuralism, which holds that the basic structure of states existing in an anarchic system determines their behavior, constructivism posits that instead the system is filled with diverse and non-deterministic actors who construct the system around them. And thus the outcomes of international relations and interactions between states are not fixed, kind of like billiard balls, like I said, but are determined by those that participate in them. At the heart of this is a couple assumptions about how states behave that are different than realism and neorealism, namely that humans and leaders of states are not fundamentally antagonistic, or they're not fundamentally opposed to one another, or not even primarily concerned with the strength and security of their own state. And that humans may be motivated by many different needs or desires or things, such as creating a better world for future generations, protecting the environment, creating, defensive security that does not appear offensive, such as purely defensive technology or systems. They might be overwhelmingly concerned with human rights and are thus not, would even accept sacrifices to their own security in order to increase the human rights or security of others. Or maybe states are actually just purely altruistic, that there are states or leaders that care more about the security and well-being of other countries than they do of their own. Constructivism's weakest points is that its insistence that there are no structural elements that shape the international system. It avoids descriptions of anarchy or self-interest when they have been the overriding conditions of human civilization for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Constructivism gestures to a world without anarchy or to a world without antagonism, without an explanation of whether or not that world is feasible or plausible given the history of human behavior that we have observed, where the overwhelming majority of the way that humans interact with one another has not, in fact, been structured by altruism or self-sacrifice for the help of another state, but instead by antagonism. Constructivism does not have a great explanation for why states behave offensively, for why states may seize territory in order to enhance their own power, nor does it have a good response to how we should deal with states when they behave offensively. And this is where the beginning of kind of the good interactions between the critique and your argument will start to appear. In that many critique arguments are implicitly constructivist in their understanding of international relations. Many critique arguments argue that there's no fixed international system, that we shouldn't focus on states, that states are bad, and that we should instead kind of consider people and movements and individuals, and that's actually what kind of constructs the international order, that it's not dominated by states. But again, this has no real good explanation for how to confront military offensive actions or power. And even if we could bracket out offense for a second and say states don't behave offensively, constructivism is still weak on how to handle individual actions of defensive military power. So how, for example, should a constructivist approach the Russian invasion of Ukraine or Crimea? That there's no good, in the immediate sense, way to use a constructivist account for how to prevent one country from just invading other countries that doesn't rely ultimately on military power. This is where I believe a lot of cross-sex arguments should be asked of critique alternatives, especially those that argue to get rid of the United States or to create fundamental changes in our approach to justice or human rights or ethics. That how would the alternative approach handling states that seek to use violence? And they may answer that they don't believe any state seeks to use violence, that states are not offensive powers, they're all fundamentally acting out of insecurity. But that's still not a complete answer. One, because according to the structural realism account that I described, states can still take aggressive military action when they're behaving defensively, especially if there's a perception gap and that they don't have complete information about the international system. And thus constructivists take that we should all kind of figure our stuff out according to like shared principles and society stuff that we're going to, you know, construct together, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't work when we don't all have complete information. And so even if you attempted to devise a constructivist solution to an international problem, that would not work if states have different opinions about the relative military strength or intentions of their opponent. So that's constructivism. We will talk more about the critique's opinion about international relations in a bit. The fifth major school of international relations, and the one that gets talked about the least, is Marxism, which, as you can probably guess, was originally formulated by Karl Marx. Marxist international relations theory, which I'm going to distinguish from Marxist social or historical criticism, which is primarily about the more individual or societal structuring power of class and labor, argues that the world and the world between states is structured by economic relations and currently by economic exploitation of the working class by oligarchs. This condition has become mirrored at the international level, defined as competition between states to maximize their relative economic power, and this is important at the expense or the subjugation of others. So Marxist international theory rejects explicitly the condition of anarchy adopted by some of the other theories, and instead posits that labor, and more specifically the capitalist mode of production, coordinates the affairs and behaviors of various states such that their decisions are not in service of self-help under an anarchic system, but instead always in the service of capital accumulation. So Marxism and Marxist international theory can be thought of as an answer to Hobbes, saying that no, there is not a condition of absolute anarchy where any state does anything according to whatever they may want or feel in whatever instance, but instead all states are actually beholden to capital. And capital is like that sovereign supranational world government that tells states what to do and what not to do. Because the collusion between capitalism and state military power has created a necessity for states to behave according to this theory of labor. And thus Marxism diverges from liberal and realist theory by its substitutions for labor and class in the place of anarchy and self-help. Interestingly enough, and the reason why I want to talk about this theory in this lecture is because out of Marxism comes the original idea of hegemony, which is the purpose of this lecture. Hegemony literally refers to the concept of ideological domination. And Marxists use the term to describe the convergence of capitalist ideology and military domination to explain the international enforcement of capitalist hegemony. So the term came from the projection or the enforcement of ideology by military power. So hegemony is a joint term. It refers both to ideology and also to power or primacy or relative strength. This concept, however, has been broadened and or conflated with merely primacy, or just the component of hegemony where you have an unchallengeable position in international affairs, which is typically due to unrivaled military strength. And this is one area where, again, debate, especially in Debating the K, makes an important error, because the conflation of hegemony and primacy often commits affirmative teams to far more than they want. Because if you're saying hegemony is good against the critique, you're not only saying that military primacy is good, you're also saying that the projection of an ideology, usually Western or capitalist ideology, via that projection, that mechanism of military power is good. And you often don't have to defend that ideological commitment. And it's often a source of a lot of K, link, and impact turn arguments that you do not have to answer. Which is why I'm now going to retitle the elective to Primacy and the K, which is actually the impact you should be reading against critique arguments, not hegemony. Quickly, there are other forms of hegemony, the most notable being liberal hegemony, which is, after our discussion of liberalism, should seem fairly simple, which is the global dominance of Western ideology propagated through international institutions, the market, and shared norms of behavior, such as democracy and human rights. So military interventions created to establish democracy in other countries, or military interventions designed to oust human rights violating governments, are examples of liberal hegemony. The Cold War proxy wars are another good example, and perhaps even the genesis of the notion of liberal hegemony, where the United States fought with the Soviet Union to convert proxy states, not only to minimize the geostrategic impact of an enemy by denying them placement of military forces or troops in various countries, which is how classical and neorealism describe the Cold War, to the insistence on minimizing the foreign adversary's ideological control of the international system, which is how Marxists and liberals describe the Cold War. So there's two kind of large schools of thought over how that war was fought, and they actually largely pivot around whether or not it was a war for hegemony or whether it was a war for primacy. So this is a good example of when hegemony and primacy have very divergent differences. Realists believe that the Cold War was fought to prevent enemies from putting weapons too close to your territory, primacy, and Marxists and liberals believe that the Cold War was fought to prevent communism or capitalism, what have you, from taking hold in the international system as to erode one of the country's leverage over the international ideology, hegemony. You should think of these schools or theories as on par with the thesis statements that are present in many critiques. Theories of power that use a combination of history and abstraction to make predictions about the behavior of people and societies are theories of power. Any good K will have a theory of power, and it is probably why you keep losing to the K while thinking you should be winning. It's no different than reading an AF about cooperating with Russia over nuclear arms control and dropping classical realism is true on another page. You can win all the little ticky-tacky stuff you want, but if you lose a structuring claim that the United States and Russia are guaranteed to fight in the long run and strength is the only way to prevent that from happening, you will lose 9 debates out of 10, even if you win that nuclear arms control is effective and is a step in the right direction, etc., or a prerequisite. This is why the link turn strategy on the K usually not so hot. So, why are arguments about military primacy or others based in international relations good against the K? First, like I just explained, they have a theory of power that is different from the critiques. If structural realism or neorealism is true, how would a radical revolutionary uprising that abolishes the US government play out? Answer, America would get promptly invaded. We have a lot of enemies and rely fairly directly on military strength and economic liberalization to avoid confrontation. For an alternative to radically restructure the United States' power such to reduce our military primacy and our economic capitalist liberalization, according to neoliberalism, would invite a neoliberalism or liberalism or even classical realism would invite a pretty direct and gruesome war. Which brings me to number 2, which is that you always almost have to impact turn the K. K alternatives or affirmatives that take no stance on military primacy or economic liberalization are bad. How revolutionary can you be while leaving the United States military or economic liberalization in place? If the alt can coexist with Trident Class 2 nuclear missiles, SMC Block 2 ballistic missile defense, space lasers, naval supremacy, Goldman Sachs, NAFTA, it can also likely coexist with the plan, which is like a criminal justice reform. And thus, the PERM probably solves, or framework has a really good art angle against all AFs that don't take an opinion on those issues. If not, you have, if they do get rid of those things, which they likely do, or will at least critique them, you have an impact turn that generates offense against the K regardless of your specific plan. Holland asked, why do you have to say economic liberalization is good? Is it just that it's an internal link to primacy? Not necessarily. It depends a little bit on what your theory of international relations is. If your theory is that economic liberalization deters conflict because it makes states mutually invested in an international order, that would be the liberal or possibly the neoliberal theory of international relations, then no, you don't have to win it's about primacy. You can just win that that is itself a safeguard against conflict. And if the AF was to say that economic liberalization or our economy was bad, you could just say that that would cause war by itself. If you were instead saying that more direct military primacy is what determines whether or not states go to war, you were probably reading a classical realist or a neo-realist account of international relations. You could still win that economic liberalization is good because it is what empowers our primacy, like you said, but you also would not need to win it. Because if you won that just direct military primacy is a thing that the AF would jeopardize, or that the K alternative would jeopardize, then you could directly get that to conflict. So what you choose as your impact and your specific internal link should be very synchronized with how you believe conflict happens, because ultimately you want to be able to get your thing to a war, if that makes sense. Okay. This is what's basically described as the hard right or impact turn strategy against the K, where you pick something like economic liberalization or military primacy and use that as kind of a catch-all impact turn for all alternatives or all critique AFs. There's a reason why I'm saying specifically economic liberalization and primacy, because those are the two that are most directly supported by the international relations theories that I've already described. So yeah. The third reason why military primacy or other IR arguments are good against the K is that you have framework defenses. IR people and scholars have some of the best method defenses of any discipline. There's a rich history of modeling, hypothesis testing, theories, and case studies to support every assumption made in this type of evidence. And since after this lecture, hopefully you'll start to be able to explain why you think your things are true, it will be much harder for judges to dismiss your arguments. Think about classical realism. I'm not recommending classical realism as a necessary impact in a lot of these debates, but I want to walk through how it works to show you how you might defend it in a debate context. You have a basic thesis principle claim that humans are antagonistic and cynical, or antagonistic and competitive, and that they will do anything to support themselves. You then have a second structuring thesis claim that states behave like the individuals that lead them. Either of those things by themselves are actually not that hard to prove if you have a lot of evidence. You can use neuroscience studies, history, case studies, opinion polls. When you're doing the second half about states, you can use history of international behavior. You can use modeling. You can do psychological profiles of international leaders to show that they behave like individuals. You can analyze conflicts from the from psychology discipline to show that conflicts mirror interpersonal conflicts, what have you. And that, you've proven both of those things. If you've proven both of those, then you've proven that internationally, states are antagonistic, they are self-help motivated, and they will fight if you do not have more power than them, which already complicates whatever the alternative or K explanation is of why a war occurs. Similarly, you will have proven your assumptions are true. When the K people say that you need to have a defense of your epistemology, of your assumptions, and you say assumption number one is that people are bad, and you prove that. Assumption number two is that states adopt the behavior of the individuals that compose them. You've proven your two assumptions, and you've met whatever burden it is to do that epistemology framework test. A side benefit is that if you've won that first thing, that individuals are bad, evil, and self-motivated, you've also likely really hurt alt solvency, because a lot of alternatives require some amount of goodwill or mindset change in the broader population that would be more conducive to whatever K impact they're advocating. which would likely not happen in a world defined by classical realism. You can do this with all of the theories, and I don't have time to do it for you, but I encourage you to work through in your head how you would prove the assumptions of the various theories of international relations. And if you start to do a little Googling or even reading existing debate cards, you'll start to see that this evidence is actually well designed to do this. But it's not utilized in this way because we don't think about the epistemological basis of international relations, even though it is an incredibly rich discipline for exactly that area. IR people care a lot that their assumptions are right, and the difference between all of the international relations theories are actually just that they slightly tweak each other's assumptions. Neo-realism argues that the assumption of classical realism that states adopt the behavior of individual people is wrong. Constructivism argues that the assumption of anarchy inherent in realism and liberalism is wrong. Marxism argues that the assumption of anarchy in neo-realism and realism is wrong, and argues that economic interdependence can be mutually beneficial according to liberalism is wrong. All of these theories share many aspects, but also critique each other's assumptions, and so they're built up to defend themselves and their assumptions against others. So really, really good work. Whereas people that are defending reforms or, warming impacts or things like that, may be a little bit less prepared to defend their assumptions because those disciplines are not as used to having critiques of their assumptions levied at them all the time. All of this also means that you have generated more points of clash in the debate with the critique, and that makes the K's life hard. Because the K often has to answer a really long 2AC and a really long 1AR on the page they need to go for, because there's usually only one offensive position in the block, they often have to rely on framing tricks and a lot of embedded clash to avoid having to answer large chunks of AF arguments. But if the AF says that military primacy is good, the K cannot frame that away or say the alt turns or solves it, just like they should say a racism impact. If the AF solves military primacy and wins that they get to weigh military primacy, the K needs to just debate that head on. The only way around that is through it. If the AF wins that the military is good, even by a 51 to 49% margin, the AF will win. In essence, this strategy turns the debate from a K debate, where there's a lot of framing tricks and abstraction and theory, back into a policy debate. So you're back on your home turf, which is a large advantage for policy debaters that have difficulty debating the K. Finally, one of the largest advantages of this strategy against the K is that your impact will outweigh. Getting your impact to extinction is a gigantic advantage in a K debate, no matter which side you're on, because it is incredibly difficult to win other impacts matter more than human extinction. In my head, there are 4 good reasons why extinction outweighs, and there's a couple other bad ones that we can talk about too, but these 4, in my opinion, are very difficult to answer. The first is that human life and consciousness and human civilization is a logical prerequisite to the determination of value, such that there can never be value that exists without people being around to perceive it and exist in it and prioritize it. So there's nothing that could matter more than extinction. There's no ethical cause that is worth causing extinction, because to do so would be to sacrifice our ability to, in the first place, evaluate that ethical cause. And therefore, human beings have to be alive in order for us to determine or to hold in value other ethical ideals. The second good reason is math or scope, that the sheer scale of suffering that will occur under human extinction, regardless of whether or not it is a logical prerequisite to value, is magnitudes larger than whatever other impact is being discussed. So if you're debating an impact that says that structural violence is bad, or racial or sexual or whatever colonial violence is bad, all of those things would both occur in the instance of the lead up to human extinction via nuclear conflict, because military war is horrendous on the toll it takes on human populations. But it is also the scale of suffering that would occur during that war also just drastically outweighs whatever the thing the AF is describing. If the AF attempts to say that that's fine, their thing is a D rule, you need the third defense of extinction, which is that deprioritization as an idea is circular. The only reason why certain impacts should be D rules or should be considered more than others, like structural violence or whatever, is that to not do so would deprioritize them. That is circular. To say that we shouldn't focus on extinction because it trades off with a focus on racism automatically assumes racism is more important than extinction, and then argues that racism is more important than extinction. This is a tautology or circular. Its conclusion is presupposed in its premise. And therefore, it is an illogical argument to say that one thing matters just because to not make it matter would mean that it wouldn't matter. You should never let someone tell you that deprioritization is a reason util or extinction are wrong. In fact, deprioritization and util, or deprioritization is a reason extinction outweighs and util are good, that they deprioritize things that are less important than extinction, which is a thing the judge should do. The converse is that just like a team that says racism outweighs extinction because otherwise we would deprioritize structural violence, in doing so, they deprioritize the large human cost of extinction, and thus by their own logic are also bad. And therefore, any way you slice it, the deprioritization reason why extinction doesn't outweigh, terrible. The fourth reason why I think extinction outweighs is moral ambiguity, which is an idea proposed by Nick Bostrom, which says that we're not 100% sure about any one ethical theory. Structural violence outweighs, we could even be very confident in, but if we're not 100% sure that that is true, we have to keep people alive to further resolve our ethical theories. And that you could not kill everyone in the name of an ethical theory if you were not 100% sure that it was right, because you'd be destroying the possibility to figure out if it was correct or if it was wrong. And thus, keeping people alive allows more developed ethical formulations that even if extinction doesn't outweigh, would allow us to further figure that out in the future. There are a couple other defenses of extinction outweighs that are weak, and they kind of rely on future generations. There's not a really good ethical defense of future generations outside of the things that I've already described. And so I actually don't recommend basing your arguments really on that, other than that future generations are necessary to resolve moral ambiguity. You can say, though, that not caring about future generations encourages ethical distancing, which makes us less ethical people, according to the K team's kind of structural violence-y ethics argument, in which case you can say that. I encourage you, when you're going for extinction outweighs and a util-based strategy, to aggressively cross-ex the critique about their ethical theory. Why are they sure structural violence outweighs? Why are they sure racism is a D rule? You should ask aggressive questions to get them to explain why those ideas are not circular tautologies, because they almost always are. Okay, I have no time left, but I will quickly answer any questions that you have. Maddox, recognizing children are our future, every model UN. Yeah, the UN cares a lot about future generations, like aggressively, funny enough. Okay, doesn't look like there's a lot of questions. I also believe you're all supposed to go jump into a webinar or have that option, so I'm not going to hold you. Thank you all for being a great audience, and I hope you learn some stuff about primacy and the K.